He abandoned his triplets, then wanted them back. But court said they already had a billionaire dad. You've stolen my family. How would you expect me to feel? Nathaniel Rivers stood face to face with Benedict Thorne, the billionaire who had everything he'd thrown away. The courthouse hallway echoed with the devastating words that had just ended his 3-year legal battle. Petition for paternal rights, denied. I didn't steal anything, Benedict replied calmly, his British accent cutting through Nathaniel's desperation like a blade. I loved a woman and her children when their father chose not to. The custody papers in Nathaniel's trembling hands bore a signature worth more than small countries. 3 children. His biological triplets. Lost forever to a man who could give them everything Nathaniel never could. But here's what nobody expected. Here's the twist that will make you question everything you think you know about fatherhood. This story doesn't end the way you think it does. What you're about to hear is the true account of a man who abandoned his pregnant girlfriend in a moment of cowardice, only to discover 3 years later that she'd married a tech billionaire and built the perfect family without him. A man who fought the legal system, spent his life savings, and risked everything to reclaim children who didn't even know he existed. And what he learned in that courthouse hallway will change how you think about love, sacrifice, and what it really means to be a father forever. Are you ready for a story that will hit you right in the heart and challenge everything you believe about second chances? Because what Nathaniel Rivers discovered about true fatherhood will leave you speechless. Let me take you back to where it all began. 4 years ago, in a cramped Seattle apartment where a young man made the worst decision of his life. If you've ever faced an impossible choice between love and fear, between staying and running, between fighting for your dreams or surrendering to your doubts, then you need to hear this story. Drop a comment below and tell me about a time when you had to choose between what you wanted and what terrified you. And if you're ready for a story that will challenge everything you think you know about family, hit that like button right now. The rain hammered against the single window of their 400 square foot apartment like nature itself was trying to break into their fragile sanctuary. Nathaniel Rivers, 26 years old and drowning in more ways than one, stared at 3 ultrasound photos spread across their second-hand kitchen table. 3 tiny heartbeats. 3 lives depending on him. 3 children he already loved more than his own life and feared he would destroy with his inadequacy. Valentina Moreau lay sleeping on their sagging couch, one hand protectively resting on her 6-month pregnant belly. Even in sleep, her face carried that serene confidence that only came from believing love could conquer any obstacle. At 24, she was everything Nathaniel wasn't. Brilliant, optimistic, absolutely convinced they could make this work despite every piece of evidence suggesting otherwise. She sketched constantly, even now. Her latest drawing lay open beside her, designs for a convertible crib that could grow with children, save families money, create beauty even in the smallest spaces. Her dreams were beautiful, practical, completely impossible given their current situation. Nathaniel was drowning. Law school had buried him under a mountain of debt that grew larger every month. He worked 3 jobs just to afford this apartment that smelled like mildew and carried the echoes of previous tenants' broken dreams. Security guard at night, delivery driver on weekends, tutor whenever he could find students willing to pay for help. 18-hour days that barely covered rent and groceries for 2 adults. How was he supposed to add 3 babies to that equation? But it wasn't just the money. The real truth, the one that kept him awake staring at the ceiling while Valentina slept peacefully beside him, was darker and more complicated. His father had been a walking disaster. Michael Rivers had tried to provide for his family and failed spectacularly, turning to alcohol when the pressure became unbearable, turning to anger when alcohol stopped numbing the pain, turning to abandonment when anger couldn't solve the impossible mathematics of not having enough money for everything that needed paying. Nathaniel had been 12 when his father finally walked out, leaving behind nothing but unpaid bills and a son who swore he would never become that kind of man. But lying there in the dark, calculating formula costs and daycare expenses and medical bills, Nathaniel could feel himself becoming exactly what he promised never to be. The pregnancy complications had forced Valentina to bed rest 3 weeks earlier. Doctor's orders meant no more income from her part-time position at Morrison and Associates Architecture. It meant Nathaniel carrying the entire financial burden on shoulders that were already buckling under the weight. "We'll figure it out," Valentina had said when he tried to discuss their impossible situation. "Love finds a way, Nathaniel. It always does." Her faith was radiant and heartbreaking and absolutely devastating because Nathaniel could see exactly how this story ended. He could see himself working 4 jobs and still coming up short. He could see the fights about money that would turn into fights about everything else. He could see himself resenting these children he already loved for needing things he couldn't provide. He could see himself becoming his father. That night, while Seattle rain turned the world outside into a watercolor painting of gray and despair, Nathaniel Rivers made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He wrote a letter. Not a text message or an email, but an actual letter on actual paper, because somehow that felt more permanent, more real, more like the kind of goodbye that couldn't be undone with a moment of weakness. His handwriting shook as he formed each word. "Valentina," he began, then stopped, staring at her name until his vision blurred. "How do you explain to the woman you love that you're about to destroy both your lives because you're too much of a coward to try building something together? I love you more than I knew it was possible to love another person. I love our children before I've even met them. That's exactly why I can't stay." The words felt like glass in his throat as he continued writing. "You deserve a man who can provide for you, who can give you the life you dream about, who can be the father our children need. I'm drowning in debt. I work 18 hours a day and we can barely afford this apartment. What happens when there are 3 babies who need everything and I can't even buy formula?" He paused, looking at Valentina's sleeping form. Even unconscious, she radiated a peace that came from complete faith in their love. It made what he was about to do feel like murder. "I see the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching, and I know you're worried too. You're just too good, too loving to say it out loud. But I can see the fear in your eyes when you think about how we're going to manage." The next part was the hardest to write, but also the most important. "My father destroyed our family because he wasn't man enough to admit he couldn't handle the responsibility. I won't do that to you. I won't stay and watch myself fail you the way he failed us. I won't let our children grow up watching their father crumble under pressure he was too weak to handle." Tears were falling on the paper now, smearing the ink in ways that somehow made the words feel more real, more permanent. "You'll be better without me. You're brilliant and talented and strong enough to build the life you deserve. Our children will be better without a father who can't provide for them, who lies awake every night terrified of letting them down." He finished the letter with words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please don't try to find me. Please don't hate me. Just build something beautiful from what we had. You're going to be an incredible mother. I love you. I'll always love you. That's why I have to go." He placed the letter on their kitchen table, next to the ultrasound photos and her latest architectural sketches. Then he packed everything that mattered to him into a single duffel bag, which wasn't much since nothing mattered more than what he was leaving behind. The last thing he saw as he closed the door was Valentina's hand, still resting protectively on her belly, still believing in a future he was too afraid to help create. Nathaniel Rivers walked out into the Seattle rain and disappeared completely. He changed his phone number, closed his email account, transferred to a different law school in Portland. He cut every possible connection to the life he'd convinced himself he was protecting by destroying. For 3 years, he told himself he'd done the right thing. For 3 years, he built a new life based on the foundation of that single devastating choice. He finished law school in Oregon, started a small practice focusing on family law. The irony wasn't lost on him, helping other families navigate the legal complexities of love and separation while running from his own. He never dated seriously. How could he, when every woman was measured against the memory of amber eyes and architectural dreams and faith in futures that terrified him? He threw himself into work, helping other families fight for custody and visitation rights, learning every legal avenue that governed parental relationships. And every night, in the quiet moments before sleep, he wondered about 3 children he'd never met, about the woman he'd left behind, about the family he'd chosen fear over. He told himself they were better off without him. He told himself that story so many times it almost felt true. Until the morning a private investigator's report landed on his desk and shattered every lie he'd been telling himself for 3 years. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered by courier to his modest law office in downtown Portland. His name was printed in block letters across expensive stationery, and something about the formal presentation made his hands shake as he broke the seal. Inside were 47 photographs and a 10-page report that would destroy every assumption he'd made about his choice to leave. The first photograph stopped his heart entirely. 3 children, approximately 3 years old, playing in what appeared to be a private playground that rivaled anything at public parks. They had his eyes. Not similar eyes, not eyes that might be his, but his exact storm gray eyes looking back at him from 3 perfect little faces that combined his features with Valentina's delicate bone structure. Isabella, Gabriel, and Adrian. Their names were written in careful script on the back of each photo, along with details that made his chest constrict with longing and regret. Isabella, artistic and curious, loves to draw and ask questions about everything. Gabriel, thoughtful and logical, already reading at a kindergarten level despite being 3. Adrian, quiet but observant, with an affinity for music and a smile that could light up entire rooms. His children. Children who had grown from babies to walking, talking, thinking little humans while he'd been convincing himself that abandoning them was an act of love. But it was the other photographs that truly devastated him. Valentina, radiant in ways he'd never seen her before, standing beside a man who was everything Nathaniel had never been. Benedict Thorne was tall, polished, successful in ways that spoke of generational wealth and unlimited resources. The private investigator had included a detailed financial profile that made Nathaniel's head spin. Net worth in the billions. Tech empire spanning continents. Philanthropic endeavors that had changed lives around the globe. More photos revealed a life that looked like something from magazines. A Malibu mansion with infinity pools and floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing ocean views beyond imagination. The children's playroom, larger than Nathaniel's entire apartment, filled with educational toys and art supplies and every possible thing a growing mind could desire. Birthday parties that looked professionally staged, with elaborate decorations and themes and guest lists that included children whose parents were household names. Family vacations to private islands, ski chalets in Switzerland, cultural tours through European capitals. But it wasn't the wealth that destroyed him. It wasn't the luxury or the endless possibilities that money could provide. It was the love. In every single photograph, love was visible like something you could reach out and touch. Benedict's hand on Valentina's back, gentle and protective and completely devoted. The way he looked at the children, not like a stepfather doing his duty, but like a man who had found his purpose in loving them completely. The way the children climbed on him, trusted him, lit up when he appeared in frames. Valentina herself looked like a woman who had not just survived but thrived beyond imagination. The investigators' report detailed her success in ways that took Nathaniel's breath away. She'd built a sustainable architecture firm that was revolutionizing green building practices across 3 continents. Her designs were featured in international magazines, her techniques taught in universities, her vision for environmentally conscious development changing entire industries. She'd taken the dreams she'd sketched in their cramped Seattle apartment and turned them into reality on a scale Nathaniel couldn't have imagined. And she'd done it while raising 3 children who clearly adored both their parents with the uncomplicated devotion that only came from being truly, completely loved. The report included a timeline that made Nathaniel physically sick with recognition and regret. Valentina had given birth to triplets 7 months after he'd left. She'd spent their first 6 months as a single mother, working part-time while caring for 3 infants, somehow managing to not just survive but build the foundation of what would become her architectural empire. She'd met Benedict at a sustainable development conference when the children were 8 months old. He'd fallen in love not just with her, but with her vision, her children, her entire approach to life. Their courtship had lasted 18 months, enough time for him to prove he was committed not just to her, but to being a father to 3 children who weren't biologically his. They'd married when the triplets were 2, and Benedict had immediately begun adoption proceedings. The children had been calling him daddy for over a year, had never known life without his presence and devotion. The final pages of the report detailed their current life in ways that painted a picture of domestic happiness so complete it felt like fiction. Benedict attended every school function, coached Gabriel's soccer team, spent hours helping Isabella with art projects that covered their mansion's walls. He spoke to them in multiple languages because he believed global perspectives were gifts to give children. He read bedtime stories in different accents because it made them laugh. Valentina had found not just financial security but partnership with a man who supported her professional dreams while being a hands-on father. She could travel internationally for work, knowing her children were completely cared for and beloved. They were living the life Nathaniel had dreamed of giving them but had been too afraid to fight for. The investigator had included one final detail that felt like a knife through his chest. Valentina had tried to reach him when the children were born. She'd called his old number 17 times before realizing it had been disconnected. She'd sent 43 emails to his old address before they bounced back. She'd even flown to New York and waited outside his old law school for 3 days, hoping to find someone who knew where he'd gone. For 3 months after the children were born, she'd searched for him with the desperate hope of a woman who still believed the father of her children would want to know they existed, would want to be part of their lives, would choose love over fear if given the chance. She'd given up only after every possible avenue had been exhausted, only after it became clear that Nathaniel Rivers had vanished so completely it was as if he'd never existed at all. Sitting in his office, surrounded by evidence of the beautiful life his children were living without him, Nathaniel felt something crack open in his chest. For 3 years, he'd comforted himself with the story that he'd made the noble choice, that his children were better off without a father who couldn't provide for them. Now he understood the devastating truth. His children weren't just surviving without him. They were thriving in ways that made his sacrifice look not like love, but like the act of cowardice it had always been. They had a father. A real father who showed up every day, who provided not just financially but emotionally, who had earned the title through 3 years of consistent devotion rather than claiming it through biology alone. But as Nathaniel stared at those photographs, a different kind of voice began whispering in his mind. A voice that said biology mattered. A voice that said his children deserved to know their real father. A voice that said Valentina might still harbor feelings for the man she'd once loved enough to plan a future around. The voice grew louder over the following weeks, drowning out logic and common sense with the seductive power of justified righteousness. These were his children. His blood. His genetic legacy. Didn't that count for something? Didn't they deserve to know where they came from? Didn't he deserve a chance to prove he'd grown into the man he'd been too young and scared to be 3 years ago? It started as a whisper and became a roar. By November, Nathaniel had made another life-changing decision. This time, he told himself, he would fight for what mattered instead of running from it. This time, he would claim his family. He had no idea how completely he was about to destroy what was left of his world. The law office of Hayes and Associates occupied the 3rd floor of a converted brick building in downtown Portland. Miranda Hayes had been practicing family law for 20 years, and her expression during their first consultation carried the particular weight that came from seeing the same mistakes repeated by different people in endless variations. Nathaniel, she said, reviewing the private investigator's report with careful professionalism, you need to understand what you're asking for. These children have never known you exist. They have a father who has legally adopted them, financially provided for them, and emotionally bonded with them for virtually their entire lives. Disrupting that. I'm not trying to disrupt anything, Nathaniel protested, though even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. I just want parental rights. Visitation. The chance to know my biological children. Miranda's expression suggested she'd heard this exact argument countless times before, always from parents who convinced themselves that good intentions could justify devastating disruption. And their current father? Their mother? The life they've built? You think introducing their birth father into that equation won't disrupt anything? They're my children too, Nathaniel said, his voice carrying the defensive edge that came from doubting your own position while refusing to abandon it. Whatever else has happened, whatever life she's built, they carry my DNA. That has to count for something. Miranda was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read the difference between parents fighting for their children's welfare and parents fighting for their own emotional needs. It counts for something, she said finally. But biology alone isn't enough to disrupt an established family unit, especially when that unit appears to be functioning exceptionally well. The court's primary concern will be the children's best interests, not your parental rights. So you're saying I have no chance? I'm saying you have a legal right to petition for paternity recognition and visitation. Whether the court grants those petitions will depend on whether they believe your presence in these children's lives serves their welfare or disrupts their stability. Nathaniel left that meeting with paperwork to file for paternity recognition and a court date that would change everything. He told himself he was fighting for justice, for biological rights, for the chance to be part of his children's lives. He had no idea he was about to discover the difference between wanting something and deserving it, between fighting for your rights and fighting for what was right. The legal battle was about to begin, and Nathaniel Rivers was about to learn that some wars are lost before the first shot is fired. The legal battle began with what should have been a simple filing for paternity recognition and visitation rights. Nathaniel convinced himself it would be straightforward. DNA tests would prove what everyone already knew, and reasonable people would work out reasonable arrangements that served the children's best interests. The reality proved far more brutal than he could have imagined. Benedict Thorne's legal team made Nathaniel's representation look like children playing dress-up. Within days of the initial filing, they responded with motions that painted a devastating picture of a man who had abandoned a pregnant woman, disappeared completely for 3 years, and now wanted to claim rights to children he'd never supported, never known, never been part of raising. Mr. Rivers seeks to disrupt the established family life of 3 children who have known only stability and love, their lead attorney argued during the first hearing. His sudden appearance serves no purpose except to satisfy his own delayed parental desires at the expense of children who have thrived without his presence. But it was the character assassination that truly destroyed him. They dug into every detail of his life since leaving Seattle, finding every woman he'd dated briefly and discarded, every job change, every sign that he was still running from commitment and responsibility. They found his financial records, his modest apartment, his struggling law practice, and presented them as evidence that he remained unable to provide the stability these children required. Most devastating of all, they obtained his therapist's notes from the year after he'd left Valentina. Sessions where he'd admitted that leaving felt like the only way to avoid becoming like his father. Sessions where he'd expressed doubt about his ability to be a good parent. Sessions where he'd questioned whether he was capable of the kind of love that children deserved. The respondent's own therapeutic records demonstrate a pattern of abandonment when faced with responsibility, their attorney argued during one particularly brutal hearing. He left because he doubted his ability to parent. What has changed? What evidence is there that he has grown into someone capable of the consistency and commitment that children require? Miranda struggled to answer those questions effectively. How do you prove that someone has changed when every piece of evidence suggests they're still running from the same fears that made them leave in the first place? The DNA tests, when they came back, were unnecessary confirmation of what everyone already knew. Isabella, Gabriel, and Adrian were biologically his children. But biology, the court was beginning to understand, was only one small piece of a much larger puzzle. The real blow came when Valentina and Benedict requested a private meeting with the judge. Nathaniel wasn't allowed to attend, but Miranda emerged from that conference looking like someone who'd witnessed an execution. "They're not fighting this to hurt you," she said quietly as they sat in her office afterward. They're genuinely terrified of what your presence in their children's lives might do to the stability those kids have known since birth. What did they say exactly? Miranda hesitated, clearly weighing how much truth he could handle. Valentina told the judge about the night you left. About finding the letter and the ultrasound photos. About being 6 months pregnant and suddenly completely alone. Nathaniel's chest constricted. He'd spent 3 years trying not to think about that moment, about what it must have felt like for her to wake up and discover he'd vanished. She told him about the first 6 months, Miranda continued. Caring for triplets by herself while building her business from nothing. About the nights when she was so exhausted she couldn't remember if she'd fed herself, but she never missed feeding them. And Benedict? Benedict told the judge about meeting 3 children who had never known their biological father existed, but who were thriving in ways that proved they were getting everything they needed. He talked about bedtime routines and scraped knees and first words and every milestone you weren't there for. The words hit like physical blows, each one a reminder of everything he'd chosen to miss. He also said something else, Miranda continued carefully. He said he understood why you left. That he might have made the same choice at 26, faced with that kind of fear and financial pressure. But he said the children's well-being had to come first, and they couldn't risk traumatizing kids who had never known instability for the sake of biological relationships they'd never needed. The media attention made everything infinitely worse. Somehow word of the case leaked, and suddenly Nathaniel found himself at the center of a story that tabloids couldn't resist. Broke father fights billionaire for rights to abandon children. The headlines made him sound like either a gold digger or a deadbeat, depending on which publication you read. Photographers followed him to work, to the grocery store, to legal meetings. They camped outside Valentina and Benedict's Malibu mansion until private security made their lives impossible. The children, thankfully, were protected by private school security and careful logistics, but Nathaniel couldn't escape the knowledge that his decision to fight for them was already affecting their peaceful lives. Weeks turned into months. The legal fees mounted. Nathaniel's small practice suffered as he spent more time in court than with clients. But worse than the financial cost was the emotional toll of watching his case crumble under the weight of evidence that he was fighting for children who didn't need him, disrupting a family that was functioning perfectly without him. The final court session was scheduled for a cold November morning. Nathaniel dressed in his only good suit and prepared to make one last argument for why his biological connection to 3 thriving children should matter more than the stable family life they'd always known. He never got the chance to speak. Judge Morrison had clearly made his decision before anyone entered the courtroom. His ruling was swift, comprehensive, and devastating in its clarity. The court recognizes Mr. Rivers as the biological father of the minor children Isabella, Gabriel, and Adrian Thorne, he began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. However, biology alone does not determine the best interests of children who have known only love, stability, and consistent care from their adoptive father. The words that followed felt like nails in the coffin of every hope Nathaniel had carried for 3 years. Mr. Benedict Thorne has legally adopted these children and has been their primary father figure since they were infants. The children know no other paternal relationship and have thrived under his care. Introducing a biological father who abandoned them before birth serves no compelling interest that outweighs the potential trauma of disrupting their established family unit. If you've ever had a moment where everything you thought you knew about yourself, about justice, about what you deserved, came crashing down around you, then you know what Nathaniel felt in that courtroom. Sometimes we fight so hard for what we think we want that we forget to ask whether we deserve it, whether it would actually make anyone's life better, including our own. Have you ever fought for something only to realize you were fighting for the wrong reasons? Let me know in the comments, because what happens next will change how you think about love forever. Petition for paternal rights denied. Petition for visitation denied. Mr. Benedict Thorne retains full legal and physical custody of the minor children, with no interference from biological parentage claims. The gavel fell with finality that seemed to echo through eternity. Nathaniel sat frozen as the courtroom emptied around him, holding papers that confirmed what his heart had already known. He had lost not just the legal battle, but any claim to the children who carried his DNA but had never needed his love. The marble courthouse hall stretched endlessly as Nathaniel stood motionless outside courtroom 7, his world reduced to the trembling in his hands and the echo of that gavel that had just severed his last legal connection to his children. "Mr. Rivers." Miranda's voice seemed to come from underwater, professional sympathy wrapped around words that couldn't soften the magnitude of his loss. "I'm truly sorry. We can appeal, of course, but given the judge's reasoning." "No." The word emerged as barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute defeat. "It's over." Through the massive courthouse windows, he could see the black Bentley waiting like a symbol of everything he'd never been able to provide. Its presence felt like a judgment, a reminder that love required more than biology, more than good intentions, more than 3 years of delayed regret. "Nathaniel." The voice made him turn sharply, his heart stopping as Valentina approached with the grace that had first captivated him 8 years earlier. She wore a midnight blue dress that probably cost more than his monthly salary, her auburn hair styled with effortless elegance that spoke of professional stylists and unlimited resources. But it was her eyes that destroyed him completely. Those warm amber eyes that had once looked at him like he held all the answers to life's mysteries now carried a mixture of sadness, resolution, and something that might have been pity. Valentina. Her name felt foreign on his tongue after years of avoiding it entirely. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Benedict is dealing with the reporters," she said, her voice steady despite the storm he could see brewing in her expression. "I wanted to speak with you privately before we left." They stood in that marble hallway like strangers, despite the children they shared, despite the love they'd once built dreams around, despite everything that connected them across years of silence and separation. "To gloat." The words emerged more harshly than he'd intended, defensive walls slamming into place. "To tell me how right you were to move on without me. To understand." She stepped closer, and he caught the familiar scent of jasmine perfume that had once clung to his clothes after their nights together. "To understand why you came back now, why you thought you could undo 3 years of their lives with legal papers and demands for visitation rights." The accusation in her tone made him flinch, but beneath it he heard something else. Hurt so deep it had calcified into protective anger. "They're my children," he said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "Whatever else has happened, whatever life you've built, they carry my DNA. That has to count for something." "DNA?" Valentina's laugh was music turned bitter, a sound that made his soul ache with recognition and regret. "Is that what you think makes a father? Genetic material?" "No, Because the man who held Isabella through her first fever wasn't connected to her by DNA. The man who taught Gabriel to ride a bike and cheered when Adrian took his first steps, that wasn't about shared chromosomes, Nathaniel. That was about showing up. Every day. Even when it was difficult. Her words hit him like physical blows, each one a reminder of every moment he'd missed, every milestone he'd forfeited when he'd chosen fear over love. "I was scared," he admitted, the confession scraping his throat raw. "I was broke and terrified and convinced I would ruin their lives the way my father ruined mine. I thought leaving was protecting them. And I was 19 and pregnant with triplets," Valentina replied, her composure cracking slightly to reveal the pain she'd carried for 3 years. "I was terrified too, Nathaniel. But I didn't run. I stayed. I fought. I built something beautiful from the wreckage you left behind." The silence stretched between them, filled with everything they'd never said, everything that had been destroyed by his choice to leave rather than fight for the life they could have built together. "I looked for you," she said quietly, her voice carrying a vulnerability that made his chest ache. "When they were born, when I was holding 3 babies by myself and couldn't understand how you could just disappear, I looked everywhere. I changed everything," he said, the admission feeling like another kind of death. "My number, my email, my school. I thought it would be easier for you if I just ceased to exist." "Easier?" The word came out like a slap. Easier would have been having the father of my children present for their birth. Easier would have been having someone to help with night feedings and diaper changes and the 1,000 tiny emergencies that come with raising triplets. Before Nathaniel could respond, the courthouse doors opened with the whisper of expensive hinges, and Benedict Thorne stepped inside. His presence immediately commanded attention in the way that only true confidence could achieve. He was everything Nathaniel wasn't. Tall where Nathaniel was average, polished where Nathaniel was rough around the edges, successful where Nathaniel had always struggled. But it was the way he looked at Valentina that truly devastated Nathaniel. Benedict's expression held the particular tenderness reserved for someone who was cherished beyond measure, protected and adored with the fierce devotion that Nathaniel had once dreamed of providing. "The car is ready," Benedict said, his voice carrying the slight accent of his British upbringing. "The children are getting restless, and the media presence is growing." His words were practical, but his eyes never left Valentina's face, clearly reading her emotional state with the fluency that came from years of loving attention. "Benedict," Valentina said, turning to include both men in her address, "this is Nathaniel Rivers." "Nathaniel, my husband, Benedict Thorne." The introduction felt surreal, like a scene from someone else's life. The two men regarded each other with the careful assessment of adversaries who understood the stakes of their encounter. Benedict's handshake was firm without being aggressive, his manner polite despite the circumstances that had brought them together. "Mr. Rivers," Benedict said formally. "I understand this situation is difficult for everyone involved." "Difficult?" Nathaniel's composure cracked slightly. "You've stolen my family. How would you expect me to feel?" The accusation hung in the air between them like a sword, sharp and potentially dangerous. But Benedict's response was measured, controlled, devastatingly calm. "I've loved a woman and her children when their father chose not to," Benedict replied, his tone remaining steady despite the provocation. "I've provided stability and security and unconditional devotion to a family that deserved those things. If that's theft, then I'm guilty as charged." The words hung between them like truth itself, sharp and undeniable. Nathaniel wanted to hate this man who had everything he'd thrown away, but Benedict's obvious love for Valentina and the children made hatred impossible. "They were supposed to be mine," Nathaniel said, the words emerging as barely more than a whisper. "They were yours," Benedict corrected gently, and there was something almost compassionate in his tone. "You gave them away. Not to me, but to fear. To doubt. To the belief that love wasn't enough to overcome practical obstacles. And you think love is enough?" Nathaniel challenged, grasping for any argument that might diminish this man's obvious superiority. "I think love combined with commitment, sacrifice, and the willingness to show up every day regardless of how difficult things become, that's enough," Benedict replied. "That's how families are built and sustained. Not through biology or good intentions, but through daily choices to put the people you love before everything else." Through the courthouse windows, Nathaniel could see three small figures pressed against the Bentley's tinted glass. Even from this distance, he could make out their faces. His eyes, his chin, his stubborn cowlick, all filtered through Valentina's delicate features and shaped by 3 years of love and stability he'd never provided. His children. Strangers who shared his DNA but called another man daddy. "Could I?" he began, then stopped, the request dying on his lips because asking felt like the final admission of his own failure. "Could you what?" Valentina prompted, though her tone suggested she already knew what he was going to ask. "Could I meet them? Just once. Before you disappear from my life forever?" The request hung in the air between them, weighted with years of regret and the impossible complexity of their situation. Valentina looked at Benedict, and Nathaniel watched some wordless communication pass between them with the fluidity of a couple who had learned to navigate difficult waters together. 5 minutes, Benedict said finally, and there was something like kindness in his voice. "In the car. But if they seem uncomfortable or confused in any way, we leave immediately." Nathaniel nodded eagerly, grateful for even this small concession. As they walked toward the Bentley, he felt his hands shaking with nervous anticipation. 3 years of wondering, of imagining, of grieving for children he'd never known were about to culminate in a meeting that would either give him peace or destroy him entirely. The November air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and the promise of winter. As they approached the car, Nathaniel could see his children more clearly. 3 perfect little faces that bore his features but belonged to a life he'd never been part of. The car door opened with the soft whisper of expensive engineering, revealing 3 small faces that stopped Nathaniel's heart entirely. Isabella, Gabriel, and Adrian looked back at him with his own storm-gray eyes, their expressions curious but unafraid in the way that children raised with security and love could afford to be. They were beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with genetics and everything to do with the confidence that radiated from children who had never known instability, never wondered if they were loved, never questioned their place in the world. Isabella, Gabriel, Adrian, Valentina said gently, settling into the seat beside them with the natural grace of a mother who belonged completely in their world, "I'd like you to meet someone. This is Nathaniel. He's your birth father." The words created a moment of profound silence in which Nathaniel could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. The children regarded him with the frank curiosity that only young minds could muster, unencumbered by the complex emotions that were tearing their parents apart. Isabella, clearly the boldest of the 3, leaned forward slightly, studying his face with an artist's eye for detail. "You look like us," she observed, tilting her head in a gesture that was purely his own. "Same eyes. Same nose, sort of. But you're sadder than we are." The innocent accuracy of her observation made breathing almost impossible. "You do look familiar," Gabriel added thoughtfully, his logical mind working through this new information. "Like someone from a dream I can't quite remember." Adrian, the quietest of the 3, simply stared with the intensity of a child trying to solve a puzzle beyond his comprehension. But there was no fear in his expression, no distrust. Only the natural wariness that came with meeting someone new. "I've wondered about you my whole life," Nathaniel managed, his voice thick with emotions he couldn't control. "You're even more beautiful than I imagined." "Mama says you weren't ready to be a daddy when we were born," Isabella said with the directness that children possessed before the world taught them to soften difficult truths. "Are you ready now?" The question hit him like a physical blow, simple in its phrasing but devastating in its implications. Nathaniel looked at these 3 perfect children who should have been his, who carried his DNA but called another man father, and felt the last of his illusions crumble. Readiness, he realized, wasn't about financial stability or career success or legal rights. Readiness was about the willingness to sacrifice everything for love, to choose commitment over comfort, to build rather than run when life became difficult. "I thought I was," he admitted, his honesty surprising even himself. "But seeing you, seeing the family you have with Benedict and your mama, I think maybe being ready isn't about me anymore." The children absorbed this with the resilience that young minds brought to complex situations, but it was Isabella who pressed further, her artistic soul recognizing emotional truth in ways that logic couldn't explain. "What do you mean?" she asked, scooting closer to the window that separated them. "I mean that sometimes love means wanting what's best for someone, even if it means you can't have what you want most." Nathaniel looked at Valentina, seeing his own realization reflected in her surprised expression. "You have a daddy who loves you and takes care of you and shows up for you every single day. That's more important than sharing the same DNA." "But you're still our father," Gabriel said, his logical mind trying to reconcile competing truths. "Biologically, I mean. We learned about genetics in our science class." "Biologically, yes," Nathaniel agreed, meeting the child's serious gaze. "But Benedict is your father in every way that truly matters. He's the one who's been here for every scraped knee, every bedtime story, every moment when you needed someone. He's earned that title through love and commitment, not just through sharing DNA." Adrian finally spoke, his quiet voice carrying the weight of innocent wisdom. "Benedict reads to us in different voices. He makes pancakes shaped like animals on Saturday mornings. He helps Mama with her building projects and teaches us about taking care of the planet. The simple recitation of daily love broke something open in Nathaniel's chest. These weren't just activities. They were the building blocks of childhood, the foundation of security, the evidence of a man who had chosen to be present for all the small moments that created big lives. "That sounds wonderful," Nathaniel said, meaning it completely despite the way it destroyed every fantasy he'd harbored about reclaiming his place in their world. "You're very lucky to have him." "We have two daddies now," Isabella announced with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children brought to complex situations adults struggle to navigate. "One who helped make us, and one who takes care of us every day." The simplicity of her statement was breathtaking in its clarity. She had somehow distilled the entire legal battle, all the complex emotions and competing claims, into a truth that honored both men without diminishing either. Benedict had been silent throughout this exchange, but now he leaned forward slightly, his expression carrying something that might have been respect. "You're welcome to be part of their story," he said quietly, his words meant for Nathaniel alone. Not as a complication or a disruption, but as the man who gave them life and then chose their happiness over his own desires. That's a kind of love too. The offer hung in the air between them, more generous than Nathaniel had any right to expect and more devastating than any rejection could have been. Because it required him to accept his role not as a father returning to reclaim his children, but as a man learning to love them enough to step aside. "Will we ever see you again?" Isabella asked, her question carrying a wistfulness that made Nathaniel's chest ache with longing and purpose in equal measure. "I don't know," he said honestly, looking at all three of them. These perfect little people who had grown from his love with Valentina but belonged to a world he'd never been part of. "That's up to your mama and Benedict. But I want you to know that even if we never meet again, I will always be proud that you exist. You're proof that love can create beautiful things, even when people make mistakes." As they said their goodbyes, tentative hugs through the car window, promises to think of each other, children's voices saying, "Goodbye, other daddy," with casual acceptance that made adults weep, Nathaniel felt something shift in his chest. For 3 years, he'd carried the weight of his abandonment like a stone, convinced that redemption required reclaiming what he'd lost. But watching the Bentley pull away from the courthouse, seeing his children's faces pressed against the window as they returned to their perfectly ordered life, he understood that some kinds of redemption required letting go entirely. The pain was intense, but it was clean pain. The kind that came from choosing love over possession, sacrifice over selfishness, their happiness over his own needs. 6 months later, a package arrived at Nathaniel's Portland law office with no return address. Inside were 3 drawings, clearly created by young hands learning to control crayons and express big ideas through small motor skills. Each drawing showed a stick figure family. 2 tall figures clearly meant to be parents, 3 smaller figures obviously children, and in each picture, standing slightly apart from the main group, another tall figure with dark hair and a carefully drawn smile. At the bottom of each drawing, in the painstaking block letters of kindergarten handwriting, were the words, "Our other daddy," and small red hearts that had been colored with the intense concentration that children brought to important tasks. Valentina had included a brief note written in her familiar handwriting. "Nathaniel, the children wanted you to know they think about you too. Isabella especially asks questions about where you are and what you're doing. Gabriel wants to know if you like the same books he does. Adrian drew you a house because he said everyone should have a place to live. Benedict suggested we might arrange a call sometime, if you'd like. The children have questions only you can answer about where their artistic talents come from, about the stories behind the eyes they see in the mirror. If you're interested, my number is still the same. P.S. They're proud of you for choosing their happiness. I'm not sure they fully understand what that means yet, but they sense the love in it." Nathaniel pinned the drawings to his office wall and cried for the first time since leaving the courthouse. But these tears were different. They carried grief, yes, but also gratitude for a love so pure it had transcended his own failures and created something beautiful despite his absence. The phone call, when it came 3 weeks later, lasted 2 hours and covered everything from favorite colors to dreams about becoming artists. Isabella's voice, bright and curious, asked him about his paintings because yes, He told them he was an artist too. Gabriel wanted to know about his books, about whether he'd read the same stories they loved. Adrian, quieter but equally engaged, asked if he missed them. "We miss you too, but we're happy. Is that okay?" Adrian had asked with the profound simplicity that only children could achieve. "That's perfect," Nathaniel had replied, meaning it completely. Being happy is the most important thing. Over the months that followed, these calls became regular but not intrusive. Monthly conversations that let him watch his children grow through their words, their questions, their evolving understanding of the world. He learned about Isabella's art classes, Gabriel's soccer games, Adrian's piano lessons. He heard about family vacations and school projects and the everyday magic of childhood lived fully. 2 years after that first phone call, Isabella called to tell him about a school project on family trees. "I put you in a special place," she said proudly. "Not with Mama and Daddy Benedict, because that's not where you belong. But not separate either, because you're still part of us. I made you into roots. The part of the tree you can't see but that helps everything grow." The metaphor was perfect in ways that an adult philosopher might struggle to achieve. He had become their roots. Invisible, essential, foundational, but not competing with the branches and leaves and fruit that made up their daily lives. Nathaniel Rivers had finally learned what it meant to love someone more than himself. He had discovered that some love stories weren't about getting the girl or reclaiming what you'd lost. Sometimes they were about learning to love so completely that you could let go, trusting that the family you'd helped create would flourish without you, knowing that your greatest gift to your children was ensuring they never had to choose between the father who gave them life and the father who gave them love. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything. And in his small Portland apartment, surrounded by photos of children who called him Other Daddy, and drawings that included him in their family story without disrupting their family life, Nathaniel had found something he'd never expected. Peace with a choice that had cost him everything and given him the only thing that truly mattered. The knowledge that his children were loved, safe, and happy in ways he could never have provided but could now protect from a distance. If this story has moved you, if it's challenged the way you think about love and sacrifice and what it really means to put someone else's happiness before your own, please subscribe for more incredible true stories that remind us of the extraordinary capacity for growth and redemption that lives within all of us. And tell me in the comments, what's the greatest sacrifice you've ever made for love? What lesson from Nathaniel's story will stay with you long after this video ends? True love, Nathaniel understood now, sometimes meant being the roots rather than the tree. Essential but invisible, foundational but not featured, present in every growth spurt and strong moment but never taking credit for the beauty that grew from soil you'd helped prepare but would never be able to claim as your own creation. It was the hardest lesson he'd ever learned, and the most important love he'd ever given.